So we are very, very happy to welcome for this edition of Series Bisha K Ali, who is an amazing British writer, director, and producer. She also chairs, orchestrates, a fellowship supported by Netflix and Sky to encourage diversity. And the session is going to be chaired by Marianne Levy, who is an independent journalist who writes, including for Telerama. And we hope you enjoyed the session as much as we enjoyed programming it, and have a great time at Series. Enjoy.
Bonjour, donc, je suis Marianne Lévy. Voilà, elle a dit que j'étais notamment critique à Télérama. On attend Bisha qui devrait surgir. Hi, hello again. Puisqu'on a une petite session ce matin pour préparer cette séance autour de la diversité. I was just saying we had a little chat this morning about this afternoon. So, Bisha, you have a very long relationship with TV. Can you tell us about your artistic path, from being an addict teenager to a woman producer, writer, and director?
Of course. Thank you for having me. I think Marianne's teasing me a little bit because I haven't been working full-time in the industry as long as you would suspect, I think. But my relationship with television and with film starts, I think, from like many of us, from when I was very young. I think I was raised by quite strict parents. So I was very much inside watching television constantly. When I was a child, I wasn't really out playing with other children. I was watching television and film. So it really started early for me. And I think a lot of the influences that I had when I was growing up are quite international. So when I was a child, I lived in England, but I also lived in Saudi Arabia, and I also lived in Pakistan. So I lived between those three countries. So the media I was consuming was American television, kind of that was being piped into Saudi Arabia, and Saudi television, and a lot of Indian television, and a lot of British television. So I was seeing things from all across the world. But to me, that's just what the media was. That's just what television was. And then as I got older, became more and more of an obsession for me, especially with film. Again, my parents very much raised us going to the cinema every evening after school. Let's go to the movies. Every weekend, let's go to the movies, because I guess instead of a babysitter, put us in a movie screen, and it's the same thing. And that was very much their attitude. So I was really raised on television and film. And I would say, in terms of how I got from that to where I am now, which is a very lucky and fortunate position, I actually did not study anything to do with the creative arts at university. I had an undergraduate degree in economics and a master's degree in international development and population studies. So nothing to do with television and film. But I was consistently writing. I was always writing. I was writing scripts for myself. I was writing scripts for my friends. I was making little movies with my friends. But nothing that I ever thought was real. I never thought that the creative industries were for me. I never saw that many people on screen once I was living full-time in the UK that looked like me, and I rarely saw in the credits of any television show names that sounded like mine. And it felt really inaccessible. It felt like an impossible thing to get to. But I kept writing those things for myself anyway. And eventually I started doing stand-up comedy. So I was a performer for about 8 years. I stopped about 4 years ago.
Just before you tell us about you being a performer and stand-up, going back to your teenage years, we talked this morning about the fact that you didn't feel represented on the screen as a viewer, as a young girl growing up. How much do you think it's important to feel represented by the characters that you see in TV shows in a society?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. I would say, if I'm honest, when I was a teenager, I wasn't actively thinking, oh, that there's no characters that look like me, or there wasn't an active conscious thought about it. I will say it's subconscious, because what you see on television and elevated as idealized or as aspirational or as interesting, basically interesting, I think that goes into our subconscious and our collective cultural subconscious of what we see as good, what we see as beautiful, what we see as worthwhile to hear about and learn about. And so I wouldn't say it was an active thing where I was saying, I'm not being represented in these stories. I don't think I had the language or the intelligence to say that when I was a teenager. Just in my individual case, not all teenagers are like that, certainly not today's teenagers. But I would say that there weren't people that looked like me, and therefore I'm inherently an outsider when I compare myself to what I'm seeing on screen. And that filters into your day-to-day life. I remember the one show that was in the UK called Goodness Gracious Me. It was a comedy sketch show, and it kind of really defined an era for South Asian people in the UK, because we finally saw ourselves on screen. It was this comedy sketch show, and they're infamous. To this day, they are kind of legends among the community, the creators of that and the stars of that show. And I think that is still the dominant, when we think about what's an example of South Asians on television in the UK, that's still the dominant one from when I was a child. And that's quite a long time ago. So that was one of the big examples. And I think that's the first time I ever thought, oh, that might be possible. There are people who can make it into this field and create something and be on screen and be part of this collective creative process. But it still felt like such a huge leap for me personally, and I think for a lot of South Asian people. Oh, I've lost your audio. Oh no.
Can we try again?
I can hear you
Okay. So how do you went from economics, from studying economics to stand-up? Because that's a very different business.
It's very different. I think I always loved stand-up in our house. That my mum was a huge fan of stand-up comedy, and I think I have an older brother, and he would always play American stand-up comedy kind of in secret, so that our parents couldn't hear the swear words. So we would stay up kind of under the covers and be watching stand-up comedy. So it's always there, kind of in the consciousness. And I think I started going to open mic nights, which is how most stand-ups begin their journey, in London when I was kind of in my early 20s. And I was thinking, wait, there aren't really many barriers to entry. You ask, and then you can go on stage, and then you can try something. And it's a really raw form of performance. It's a really raw form of creation, because you know very quickly if you're not doing well. You know very quickly if people are enjoying what you're doing or not enjoying what you're doing. So you're editing in real time. There's no notes from a script editor. There's no notes from a producer. There's no notes from the network. It's very quick in those terms. So it's a very freeing medium. So I started by going to those open mics and realizing anyone can do this, and why not me? And so I started doing it there. I think also when I was working at The Economist for about a year and a half, and they were lovely, very nice to work for, a lovely newspaper magazine to work for. And I think at one point I had just signed a permanent contract, which was quite hard to get. And someone from another team came over and said to me, oh, in a few years, Bisha, I can imagine you moving over to my team. You're doing really well. And I just thought, oh my gosh, I can't be at a desk for 2 more years. I can't do it. And I quit that job 2 weeks later. And then I was just doing stand-up as much as possible.
Okay, and so acting, stand-up is a form of acting?
I think there's elements of acting. I don't know that I respect actors so much. I don't know if I could do what they do, because they have to be so vulnerable and put so much of their trust in the director and in their cast and crewmates. And I think what they do can be so beautiful and so painful for them to do. I don't know if I have that. I don't know if I have the skill of an actor. I don't know that I was a particularly good stand-up comedian either. I think what was such a draw for me was that immediacy of create something in my mind and put it in front of people. And that feedback loop was really addictive for me. But no, I don't think I can act. I think I've done a few auditions, and I learned very quickly that it wasn't for me. And I have so much respect for the actors that I've been so lucky to work with, and kind of whether they're at the beginning of their journeys or really well established, that relationship is so precious to me, because I know a hint, just a taste of how hard it can be for them. So no acting for me, no. But I think what stand-up led me to as well is a sideways access to the industry, because producers come to live comedy shows. And from the way that I speak and the way that I carry myself, they came to this is how I started really, is a few producers came to me and said, we have a feeling that you write. Where are your scripts? And I was like, yes, I do write. Here are my scripts. And I was ready when that time came. And that really was the beginning of how I moved into the industry. So kind of sidestepped in my own sneaky way. So I had all these scripts already. I met with a bunch of different producers. Sky, early days in my career, Sky they fund a table read. And they funded a table read and put loads of agents in the room, loads of other people from the industry in the room, so they could see who I was, what my writing was, what my voice was. And off the back of that was how I signed to my agent. And then with the agents, it kind of snowballed in terms of taking lots of meetings and getting to where I am now.
Okay, so in Britain, writing is a craft that you learn at university. You didn't went this way. The voice of yours, which is very specific, you've made it in the stand-up, you think?
I think so. I think I was always writing, and I think I would kind of put myself through no film school with obsessed. I remember when I was 13 watching kind of the Martin Scorsese's list of 100 greatest films and being like, this is film school when I was 10 years old. And that was how I was kind of filling my mind from a very early age. And I think the practical side of making things with people was something I was constantly doing. And again, when it comes to stand-up, you're making things and you're presenting them to an audience. So no, I did not have the formal training of going to school to write. I think with any craft, it's doing and then you learn more. So if you're constantly writing and you're reading the greats and you're learning about technique and you're reading the books that are telling you about form and structure and you're reading the Greeks and you're reading all of those things, you can educate yourself. And I think you can get to a certain point where your work is indistinguishable after a certain point to producers from who went to film school, who didn't, who studied what. When it comes down to it, it's the script. And I think that's kind of that ethic and that work ethic is what I think saw me through.
Okay. Diversity was always an issue from the start. That's something you were very aware of.
And I think when I say diversity, I do mean racial and ethnic diversity, but I also mean the inclusion of any minority group is really clearly missing in a lot of our industry. I think one thing that I talk about is along racial lines and around cultural backgrounds, but also we need to talk about the fact that people with disabilities are deeply underrepresented in our industry as well. And I think that's clear from who we see on screen. And I think certainly in the case of racial diversity, when you weigh it up against disability, there are way more diverse people on screen than there are people with disabilities. And I do think it's always been a problem. I think also is what we see on screen, does that marry up with what we're seeing behind screen? Does it marry up with the rooms that we're going into where the decision makers are? Does it marry up with who the heads of departments are when we go onto a set? Does it marry up with who the crew are when we're going onto a set? So we can be telling really diverse stories. Are the people telling those stories diverse as well? And I don't think that there's a one-for-one, and I don't think that there's been I do think that there's been, significant change in the past 10 to 15 years. I don't think we're done.
Okay. It's when we look at British television in France, we see it very diverse compared to our television. And when we talked this morning, you were very amazed by that. You said, oh, you think British television is diverse? So even now, that's an issue that the networks are addressing openly. It's still a challenge for diverse artists in any kind of jobs to make it on television.
I think absolutely, and I think I was really amazed to hear you say that, because then I thought, well, I'm not au fait with French television and what the landscape is like from your perspective. But from my perspective, there can be a lot of inclusion, I suppose, in British television, but I think there's a glass ceiling that creatives hit very quickly here, where can we be the leads in our stories? And can the creators who create those stories, can the people behind the camera be more diverse as well? And are those things stacking up? Also, that reflects how those stories are told. I think there was this great study that Riz Ahmed's done with his new, it's sort of a creative think tank called Pillars, that's about the inclusion of Muslim characters on screen and also Muslim creators behind the screen. And the findings of that were really heartbreaking, that there are billions of Muslims on earth, and the way they're represented on screen are really as either perpetrators of 30% as perpetrators of violence, 50% as victims of violence. The majority of women don't have much agency, and I just think that's a ridiculous depiction of what modern Muslims look like, certainly in the UK, for example. So I think there's this loop that we're not addressing, that is that how we're represented on screen affects how we think culturally about each other and affects who gets those jobs to tell those stories. And then we're in this cycle that kind of goes on and on until people decide to stop and decide to change how that cycle works. And I think it's things like that that feel big and feel like this big machine that how can we interrupt any part of it, and how can we make effective change that sometimes I feel overwhelmed by. And I think, how can I make a small change where I can see a clear problem that I can find a solution to? That's my approach. And I think the fact that from your perspective, it is very diverse, I don't know, it makes me ask a question about what you're experiencing over in France, to be honest.
We were also talking about the ambiguity of the statistics, because in France that's something that's illegal, and it's legal in Britain, and yet you said that you had to be cautious with numbers, because it wasn't always a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's this. Personally, it feels like a real catch-22. I don't want to have to be labeled or categorized. I don't want to. Frankly, I would rather be on a panel talking about craft and not talking about diversity. And I hope one day we can get there. And I think a lot of my creative peers would say the same thing. Like, why don't we get invited to talk about our work? And instead we're invited to talk about diversity, which is important and vital. And I know that in the long-term picture of history, this is where we are, and I'm happy to do my part. But I also would like to be able to be a creative. But and that's what I mean by sometimes I feel frustrated that I get put into certain types of categories of a certain type of creator. Women generally very rarely get to be seen, certainly in the UK and in America, though it's changing, as auteurs. Apply that even more so to people of color and women of color. And I think that categorization of you're this race or you're this background and this is the class, and certainly in the UK, the class system plays into it. It feels bad, it feels dangerous, and it feels like really minimizing of what is diverse about us and what is unique about us and what is humanizing about us. But that being said, being able to capture statistical data, and maybe because I'm a data analyst from my past life, I don't know, being able to capture that statistical data and being able to say, there is a problem here, we have the numbers to show you the problem, and being able to kind of, not necessarily causality, but make correct connections between what that means for people and how it affects the moral line, but also from a business perspective. Money's being left on the table by not including more diverse voices and not meeting the needs of a more diverse audience. And our audiences are getting more and more diverse as we move forward in time. So there's a kind of capitalistic financial reason to be looking at this issue. There's also, in my opinion, a moral reason to be looking at this issue. So there's twofold, and we can address both of those by really having those statistics. So in the UK, we have the Diamond Diversity Standard now, where we're able to look at end-to-end on a production. And the BBC have signed up to this, Channel 4, Netflix, Channel 5, I think, and ITV as well, where we're looking at who are the people that are making up a production from beginning to end. And we can look at those numbers really clearly. And the more data we have, the more of a cohesive argument we can make. And so in that sense, I think, again, in the kind of long-term historical perspective, I think it's really important to have that data. We didn't have it before. Now we had like a feeling, we had instincts, we had what we could see on television and record from what was made afterwards, and we could do guesswork. But being able to have access to what the actual numbers are is, I think, going to really help us going forward.
So obviously it's important in front of the camera, but for you even more important beside, and on all the jobs that are beside the camera, which one are more crucial to make this diversity issue progress?
I have one very simple answer, but it might get me in trouble. I think that I think wherever we can find people in different places is important. I think the key thing is that in the positions of power at the top, if we're going into those rooms and there's only one person of color almost every single time, we have a problem. And because that's where unconscious bias sets in, that's where explicit bias sets in, frankly, and who gets hired beneath them, it all starts to come all the way through. And I think it would be great to have more diverse commissioners in the UK, just across the board. And I'm not saying we should be taking I think there's a myth where for every new diverse hire, a white man somewhere is losing his job. And I get very frustrated when I hear this, when I think that's just categorically untrue. That's not how this works. We're saying there's room at the table and that the table can expand and include more of us. So I think as many positions of power where rooms that people of color haven't historically been allowed into, whether overtly or covertly, the better, because then we don't have to spend as much time explaining things. I think another trap that a lot of creatives from diverse backgrounds sometimes end up stuck in is it's not just our job to be a creative, it's also suddenly our job to educate someone on what is or isn't appropriate, on what is perhaps a racist act or isn't a racist act, while juggling the social mores of that situation, while juggling your desire to create a piece of work and defend it in different social lines that come into play with it. And that can be really frustrating. It's a whole other job to be a racial guardian of a production. And none of us asked for that job. So I think the more people who can understand these issues, engage with them and have open conversations and become more comfortable talking about race, become more comfortable talking about there aren't enough disabled people in this production, there aren't enough people of color in this production. I think if we can have those conversations without getting defensive, without getting frustrated, without feeling like anyone's being belittled, I think we'll get to a better place more quickly. But at the moment, it feels like there's often 3 different layers to a conversation happening at once. And I think the more people of color are in positions of power, the less we have to have those conversations. And there's more of a collective movement forward of understanding, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Do you, we were talking also this morning about the fact that for a long time it was not an issue for the networks and that it became an issue. And now, where are we in the story of TV being open to everyone?
I think people have sat up and noticed more and more as time goes on. I think part of it is that we live in the age of the internet, which brings its positives in that I know that there's a lot of these other big cultural questions around this, but I do think having access to more voices that otherwise weren't being listened to is a net benefit of the internet. And I think part of that pressure has come from communities that have been able to organize and be able to speak to each other. And also us reaching a critical mass of more and more creatives from minority backgrounds in this field, which is forward progress. And where more of us in positions to be able to speak up and be able to say this, we're leaving money on the table, or we're being exclusionary, or we're being elitist. There's more people able to openly say it, and more people who feel like they can. I don't think I would have felt like I could have said half the things in this conversation 2 years ago. Now I feel like I can, and that's because of the opportunities that I've had. So I think because of the progress that we've had, we're seeing an acceleration in progress, and I think that's a good thing. So I think we're in a really exciting moment. I think there is forward change. I think that ears are open in a way they haven't been before. And I think people are seeing that cycle really clearly and can see that it's immoral. there's an overt detrimental element to people's quality of life if we don't act on changing our media landscape. And I think people are engaged with that idea in a way that maybe they weren't engaged with it 10 years ago. So I am optimistic. As negative as I can sound sometimes, I am very optimistic about the future.
Okay, so you not only you've made your own personal journey in TV, but you also want to make possible for other people to make their own journey and to make their voice heard. So can you tell us about the fellowship you launched?
Yes, of course. So the fellowship that we launched with Netflix in association with Sky here in the UK, it was something that there was a seed of the idea when kind of years ago when I was going for my meetings or my general meetings and I was meeting with agents and I was getting the tube, the underground, the metro into London every day. And that would cost like £6.70 every single day or something like that. I can't remember, to be honest. And it was very expensive. And then if I thought if I paid for my trains into town, then I have to take a bus between these meetings, and I can't afford lunch if I do that. I have to take time off my other job to go and take these meetings. And I felt really overwhelmed. I felt like I don't have a support system financially to take care of me in this period of time. And that's something that I think in the UK industries at that bottom level is a real problem. That we keep saying that we want to include more people from working class backgrounds. We say we want to include more diverse people, but from communities where they don't necessarily have a financial safety net. And as I kind of met more and more people who I love working with and I adore, but when you come to understand their financial background, it's very clear that they're okay to be able to do that and that there is a safety net for many people in this industry. And I think that's very, maybe specific to the UK industry, but I do think it translates over to the US industry as well. And I don't know if you can speak to this in France, that there's just more money there. There's more moneyed people. And so breaking into that as an outsider who doesn't come from exactly that same background. And to be clear, I'm very privileged. I'm very lucky. I had financial support, but even then I was struggling a huge amount. So imagine someone with even less financial support than I had. So that was an issue that I had when I was starting. And when I met with Anne Mensah, who is the VP of Netflix UK, and she was very open to hearing about my experiences. And one of the questions she asked is, why did you go to America? How did we lose you? How did we lose you and how do we get you back? And I said, look, these are the barriers to entry. I hit a glass ceiling, but I felt like a glass ceiling very quickly. And I felt like I had to move to kind of get more opportunity. And some of the things that I faced at the very beginning of my career were these things. And then she said to me, well, how can Netflix help us make a change and build a relationship with new writers like you, who don't then feel the need to go somewhere else to build their careers. And I think that was really important to her to understand the issues from my perspective as someone who is an outsider breaking into the industry. And so I was looking at those problems and I said, really, the problem comes down to money. You're a huge network. The problem comes down to money. Let's give new writers who we see it, and to be specific, not new writers in terms of this is their first script necessarily, but new as in haven't broken into the industry yet, but have been doing the work of their own in their own time, the way that I was. Let's give them a financial cushion for 1 year and say, here, this is time for you to spend working on your own scripts, improving yourself. Let's also provide them with access to people that they otherwise don't have access to, that I can now provide access to, that she can provide access to, that Sky can provide access to. Let's give everybody their first credit, their first television credit. That felt really important to me, that this fellowship is impact driven, and that at the end of it, they've had a year of paid time to work on their own work, which they keep the rights to, but also that they get their first television credit, because it's about building credibility. The more of an outsider you are, the more you have to prove that you are credible and reliable and can do the job. Even if there are other people who can kind of shoot ahead for other reasons, you have to, if you're an outsider, prove so many times more. And I think one of those things was getting people their first credit. And that felt very, very important to me. And along the way, other workshops that we're going to provide to the fellows include workshops on mental health for creatives, which honestly, I'm like, I should attend this too, and workshops on financial planning and things like that.
This mental health was really funny. Can you tell us about that a little bit? Because that's unusual to speak openly about that.
I'm happy to speak openly about my terrible mental health with all of you. That's fine. I think there's a couple of different things that play into it, right? Artists are artists, I guess, first and foremost. So I think sometimes it feels like it comes with the territory. But I think also your lifestyle often is freelance, and that can be incredibly stressful because it feels like, well, how am I going to get how am I going to survive if project doesn't happen? And then suddenly there's so much more pressure on a television project for you as an individual, and you can't talk to anybody about it because you have to be confident and sure of yourself all the time, and you can't show any fear around it. But at the same time, that's your bread and butter, and especially at the beginning of your career, the payment for writers in the UK is incredibly small. You're getting a few options here and there, £1,000 here, £1,000 there, and that's supposed to last you like a full year. It's really, really terrifying. And I think that's one element that your life feels very insecure when you're a beginning writer, at least in my experience. Secondly, the amount of pressure. I think certainly if you're an outsider in these fields, I certainly feel a lot of pressure. And I think sometimes if you're the only person in a room, you can feel different kinds of pressure where you feel like I have to behave in a certain way. I have to carry myself in a certain way. I have to have good answers to everything all the time, or I have to have more experience than I have. Imposter syndrome is a thing as well. When you visually don't look like people in the room, you feel like an imposter because you are in that moment. In that moment, physically, you feel that you are an imposter. And that builds up in your body over time. I think your mental health directly affects your physiology and vice versa. So I would love to equip people with more tools, certainly than I had at that time, to just prepare and be able to tackle what it is to be a creative in 2021, especially right now. My goodness, I think a lot of people are more open to conversations about mental health after the year that we've all had. So that was always really important to me, that we address it somehow. And if another change that I could make in my life in this industry and all the industries is that we're more open to talking about mental health and things like depression, I would be very, very happy. But one thing at a time, I think.
And the rest of the program, can you tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, so the other part of it is there being mentorship. So, I mean, they'll all be mentored by me to some extent. We'll meet at the beginning and at the middle and at the end, and we'll be doing sessions in between. But other sessions with the writers to, again, just break down some of the obfuscation that happens and make things more transparent. So, for example, a session where I'll bring agents from different agencies and say, here's how you can best build a relationship with your agent. I don't know how anybody else feels, but sometimes I feel like my relationship with my agents is like a marriage. We spend a lot of time together. We talk every few days and we're talking about ideas in our lives. And I think that relationship and that trust can be really important, and it takes work. You have to build it together and be on the same page, I think, often creatively. And also, what's your approach to your business? You are a business. What's your approach to it as business partners? So I think having sessions like that can start those conversations and educate like new writers as much as possible on how that works. But I think at that point, a lot of the mentality is, I just have to get an agent and then everything's going to be okay. But that's just not true. That's not how it works. You have to get an agent and then learn to work together to build a career. And that's something that also is really important, is the idea of moving people from a mentality of, I need to do one TV show. This is my dream TV show. If I get to make it, then I've done it. I've done everything I want to do, which is great and lovely. And I hope that they get to make those TV shows. But that's very hard to promise anybody. I would like to change that perspective to, I want to be a creative artist with a long career, and make that mentality shift. I think will come with time and with more information and with more learning and more sessions, meeting different producers, meeting different networks, seeing what the possibilities are. So then your ambitions can grow, and also your approach to how you run your business and how you approach your craft will change with more understanding of what is possible and how it can be made possible. So that feels really important too, is this idea of it's a career, it's not a TV show. And that's something that I hope I can bring to the fellows as well.
Okay, now we're going to take some questions before wrapping the session. C'est à votre tour maintenant de...
Bonjour, ça vous dérange pas? Ça vous dérange pas si je parle en français?
Do you get a translation of the question? Or do I... Bisha?
I didn't hear the translation, but I'm happy to hear. I can't hear it at all.
I'm going to try to be a translator, but I'm just trying. That's not my usual job.
Déjà, je voulais vous remercier pour cette heure, parce que c'était vraiment passionnant.
Je vais faire au fur et à mesure parce que comme c'est pas mon métier, j'arriverai pas sinon. He wanted to thank you because he was really interested in what you shared with us.
Donc, j'essaye d'être rapide. Je suis moi-même scénariste pour la télé française depuis 20 ans.
He's a French screenwriter. He's been working for 20 years for French television.
Et c'est une problématique qui me touche parce que j'ai très longtemps habité en cité.
And he's very concerned by our discussion because he's been living a very long time in projects.
Et je peux confirmer ce que vous avez dit, c'est bien pire en France qu'en Angleterre.
He confirms that it's much worse in France than in Britain.
Et c'est, je pense, le désintérêt de la télé en général pour les classes populaires. C'est celui de la société, hein, c'est un reflet de la société en fait.
I think that the fact that commissioners are not interested in middle class or working class is just a reflect of the society which isn't interested in those people.
Et d'ailleurs, on a une illustration directe avec le nombre de personnes qu'il y a dans cette salle.
C'est
un peu triste.
We have a direct illustration of this lack of interest because the first row are empty in the theater. I don't know if you can see the theater.
Well,
Bisha?
not too many.
Because let's say the first 6 rows are empty. So he says that reflects the fact that society is not interested in working classes.
Et malheureusement, je vois pas grand-chose qui bouge.
And unfortunately, unlike you, he's not very optimistic about that.
Voilà, merci.
But vous aviez une question?
Non, en fait, c'était pour appuyer le
He
témoignage.
wanted to share.
Désolé.
He had no question. It was just sharing his thought.
Désolé.
No,
No, don't be sorry. Thank you.
Merci.
I appreciate that so much, and I'm sorry to hear that it's empty, and I'm sorry to hear that that problem is pervasive here and there. I know you have far more experience than I do. Just to respond to what you said, you have far more experience than I do, and I really value that, and I appreciate that, and I understand your lack of optimism. But we have to keep trying. I just think we have to keep trying. I do think it's a moral imperative, and we have to keep trying. Even if the room is empty, you're in the room. Even if I'm by myself in every room I walk into, I'm in the room, and I think we have to keep trying. And I appreciate that. And someday, I talked about my mental health. Part of this is my mental health too. Some days I just can't. But I just feel very strongly that even as I feel the most negative, I feel like I have to keep trying because somebody before me kept trying so that I could be here. And I think as much as I wish this was over, we have to keep going. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question dans la salle? Oui, je vous en prie.
Bonsoir. Je dirais que je m'appelle Rodolphe et que je suis comédien et scénariste en France.
His name is Rodolphe. He's a French writer and actor in French, obviously in France.
Et la question que j'avais, c'est quel conseil elle aurait pu donner aux jeunes scénaristes venant justement des minorités qui ont des projets, que ce soit de séries télé ou de films qui sont écrits, mais qui n'ont pas en fait l'accès aux plateformes, que ce soit Netflix, Disney et autres, pour justement les présenter et éventuellement présenter des projets justement avec de la diversité, avec des personnes issues d'un peu partout dans le pays.
He wanted an advice. What advice would you give to a young screenwriter who has no access to the platforms and who has projects, diverse projects, and how can you get an access when you don't have an access, basically?
Oh my gosh, I wish I had an answer for you that was helpful. I think looking at the access points, and I can't speak to the French industry, unfortunately. I think going and meeting people is the most important. If you can make relationships with producers who are interested in what you're interested in, that will really help. building your relationships is the most important thing. And can you make things with your friends is one thing I will say. Can you make things that are undeniable with your friends and with your peers that then can get attention and kind of give you some access? Because talent is attractive to people. If they can see talent, they will come and I do think that there's a bit of that desire. I think another thing is I look at the opportunities in the UK. There are things like the BBC. There's the writers' room scheme. There's things like the fellowship that I set up that are entryways. I think the reason so many people want to talk to me about the fellowship is there aren't that many opportunities like it in Europe, and I think people are excited by the fact that it exists. And I don't know, maybe we will be able to expand next year, and it won't just be the UK. I'd be very proud to do that. But the biggest thing is keep writing, keep creating, keep building that network of people that you have access to, producers, and they will, if you can find a producer who believes in your work, that's going to be the biggest thing possible. How do you access those people? It's the time of COVID is really difficult, but I'm sure there are networking events in your area, in France, sorry, not necessarily in your area. So those are the ways that I would access, but making things and improving yourself is always going to be the number one pathway. But unfortunately, I can't speak much to the pathway in France, so I apologize for that.
Don't be apologized. Thank you.
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question avant de terminer la... Ah, there's a French journalist with a very famous weekly magazine who wants to ask you a question. Her name is Marjolaine Jarry.
Thank you very much for this very interesting session. I would like to ask if ever you could talk about your writing on sex education, if you could talk about maybe the specificity of this writer's room and how did you evolve maybe in your writing or working with it?
Of course. I will say that sex education was my very first television credit. It was really exciting for me to be involved, and honestly, I was very I was the most inexperienced person in that writer's room. It was a very diverse writer's room. Laurie Nunn and Sean Grace Robbins were the kind of showrunner and the head writer together. And they really had a very diverse writer's room. Still one of the most diverse writer's rooms I've ever been in. And the process in a UK writer's room is very different from the US writer's room. So I've been in both now. So I'm lucky enough to have those different experiences, having done the UK ones and then doing the US ones. And then now I'm back and doing some UK ones again. And I think that first time it's exhilarating because it's very much you're sharing ideas constantly in a room, and sometimes they won't fit with the idea of the head writer, and they're kind of curating all of these ideas and lacing them together. And it's really such a collaborative experience. I would say that Laurie Nunn, who was the head writer on that, all the specificity, all the kind of grace she gave to the topic that we were discussing, which could have been a very difficult topic especially for, I think, a UK show. The topic was, I think, difficult for us to approach in a way. And I think Laurie Nunn led us through that process with real grace and with real intelligence and empathy for our characters. And the way that we were tracking that was really, we had these massive spreadsheets on the wall where we were tracking characters in every single scene across the entire show. We were really using, I think I just love Excel from my old days. So I think that was a really big learning curve for me, was the level of specificity, the level of detail, and being able to contribute to that writer's room when I felt so green, I felt so new, and I felt like such an imposter. But they really wiped all of that away and really built my confidence as a writer and as a contributor in that room. So that was on sex education, really the kind of earliest job that I had. And it was after that that I went on to work on 4 Weddings and a Funeral in the US. And that was another whole different experience. And then writing for Marvel for Loki, and then for Miss Marvel after that. So that was kind of the trajectory very quickly in terms of writer's room specifically.
Thank you very much, Bisha. We have to wrap this session. It was really nice talking to you, and I hope to see you in real life next year.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Take care.